Sort of as we get into the early stages of this election campaign, we're seeing a little bit of an uptick when it comes to polling support for the Prime Minister. It is looking relatively close. Do you see the leaders at this point sort of addressing the crux of what voters want to hear?
That's right, Heidi. It is a bit of a line ball at the moment. Leaders are very close. There's some interesting polling out that's looking at some of the finer points of how their leadership is being received by the Australian public, that looks at things like, would someone like to have a beer with them in the pub? But obviously a key concern in this election campaign is whether voters feel like they're being listened to. And I think that's really going to drive the way that they're campaigning in the weeks to come.
We've been talking about sort of the various forces at play here, obviously the internal sort of issues with the cost of living crisis, but that's also going to be affected by the external issues, which is the trade and broader alliance concerns over the US and the Trump administration. On the other side, the increasing sort of assertion by Beijing as well. Do you think either Albanese or Dutton are sort of addressing these bigger geosecurity concerns?
I think this is the key reality for the Australian election, that while leaders are out campaigning, visiting many seats over the coming weeks, the media is still giving top billing to what's happening in the US or, as you said, in China. And so that becomes the soundtrack to which the election campaign is being played out. Voters at the same time want to know that their concerns with cost of living, how that's actually experienced, is being understood. And for people, that comes down to, is that fear that when they get to the supermarket checkout that they can't pay for the contents of their trolley. Is that really being understood, or are only Band-Aid solutions being offered? So both major political parties are needing to find solutions that speak to voters' concerns. And I think there's still a sense that this generalised distress that people feel is not fully appreciated by political parties. There is a reality for people that we've had a change from really, a wage economy in Australia to an asset economy that's driving a wedge between the haves and have-nots. And we're not yet really seeing policies that address the reality of that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because just a few years ago, we saw Labor returning to power, pushing issues such as climate action, not to mention Indigenous rights. How are these other issues being superseded now by the cost of living crisis that Australians are feeling?
Yes, I think the cost of living crisis is playing out on top of a real change in the nature of equality and inequality in Australia. So where once it was a wage economy, now it is an asset economy. So merely looking at cost of living is not enough to understand what is being experienced by people. If we think about inflation in Australia, it's being driven to a large degree by housing undersupply, but people are experiencing that in terms of housing insecurity. And so that's why housing gets bound up so much with cost of living discussion in Australia. And ultimately, Australians want to know, how is that being engaged with by politicians? And is there really a future-looking proposition? Is there a case for a second term for an Albanese government or a change in government?
In the budget released last week, we saw Treasurer Chalmers announcing surprise tax cuts for every voter. How are these issues going to play into the minds of voters?
I think tax cuts are always very popular, and it's really the advantage of an incumbent government to use a budget so closely timed with the announcement of election to provide a springboard into an election campaign. In a sense, in Australia, we've had a shadow election campaign since Australia Day. That's the end of January. It was an announcement effectively in a campaign period, and it tends to play very well. At the same time, people want to know that care is going to be there when their ageing parents need it, that there is a reliable healthcare system, and hence this race to match commitments around protection of Medicare and bulk billing of doctors, and really a concern about what is the future of the country. And interestingly there, Labor is making a play of connecting the left of politics with a new form of patriotism, talking about the Australian way. So again, that's a connection to I guess an understanding for people that geopolitical tensions are looming large, and I think there's an understanding that the Australian public want to hear that this is being engaged with, and the time is there to speak to it and to shape up this sense of an Australian way.
Do you think that will be effective here? Because we've seen that, basically account for the perhaps unexpected revival of the Liberal Party, big L Liberal Party in Canada, for example. We've seen that in a number of other global elections.
I think the timing of the election, that it was necessarily delayed because of Cyclone Alfred, has given both political parties an opportunity to think about how they want to respond to President Trump, and has given a new appreciation to voters of what might be effective for Australia and our engagement with our ally. And so, for voters, they want to see that a nuanced approach, it seems, is playing quite well with voters, that there'd be a considered approach by a Prime Minister. And that's reflected, I think, in some of the polling we discussed earlier.
I wanted to get your view on the power of the teals this time, right? Arguably even more powerful. Do you expect them to be kingmakers this time? And also, given that a lot of their traction is obviously in inner city seats with inner city metropolitan issues, can they repeat that influence, when it comes to more of the suburban and rural areas?
It's obviously decisive in Australia of how the composition of government will come up. So the teals, obviously, as part of potential crossbench, have the ability to help a major party form government. And we've seen in the past how the days following an election can become very decisive in that. One major factor for the teals in this election is that they're no longer able to draw a sharp contrast with Scott Morrison as Prime Minister. And so that will be interesting to see how does their proposition to voters shape up in a changed context. But still, their promises around reflecting community values and community voice are very appealing to voters who want to know that their voice will be heard and represented in Canberra.
Kate, really great to have you with us. Kate Harrison Brennan, who's a director of the Sydney Policy Lab at the University of Sydney. We do have more on Australia Ahead. That's every Tuesday at 11:40am if you're watching here in Sydney, 8:40am if you're joining us in Hong Kong. Plus, you can tune into the Bloomberg Australia podcast, delving into the biggest stories shaping the country's role in global business. You can find that on Apple, Spotify or Bloomberg.com.